Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Now, I can easily imagine, especially for the colleagues from US and Canada, it may be hard to justify why somebody comes here and talks about promoting fire, knowing what has happened lately in areas like New Mexico and Arizona or British Columbia. Nevertheless, I take the risk, stressing that my perspective is a Fennoscandian perspective. And saying that I really hope that at the end of this talk I can give some messages also that have relevancy beyond the systems or context of Fennoscandia. But let's begin from the fire suppression part, which is just as a background for this talk. And here we have a classic study by Swedish Olle Zachrisson almost from 50 years ago, where he looked at annually burned area in northern Sweden based on dendrochronological analyses. And like you can see from his results, it goes a little bit unusual way, the x-axis, so that the distant past is on the right and current times are on the left. In earlier times, about roughly 1% of the forest land in this study area burned annually. But during the past 150 years, practically no fires. So this is what is an indication of fire suppression. Now, I'm not going to talk the reasons what maintained the fires before 1800s and what suppressed those after that. Just give this as a background that we have lost fires from the forest ecosystems in Fennoscandia largely. Those mechanisms and reasons and processes behind this observed pattern are, of course, very interesting and important on their own. And this has been, since then, as you probably know, it has been verified for many other sites in Northern Europe, but also elsewhere in the world. So, but before going on, talking about the reintroduction of fire to Fennoscandia, I think it's good to look at the landscape we are talking about. Quite clearly, we are not talking about the landscape that existed in late 1800s, but something else that is relevant now. And we are talking about intensively managed landscape. Intensively managed both at the stand level and at the landscape level. At the stand level, the prevailing silvicultural forest management method is based on clear cut with some quite heavy soil preparation, soil treatment together with that. Here you can see one of the clear cut areas. And at the landscape level, it may look like this quite typically. Mineral soil forests, here overlaid with the photo, intensively managed, but also the peatlands in between mineral soils are widely ditched for forestry purposes. So we are talking about really intensively managed landscape. In fact, about 90% has been and is intensively managed since the fire suppression period started. And this is the landscape where we are now trying to understand what and should we bring fires back. But how fires then affect these can be called perhaps multi-modified forest landscapes. And can we and how emulate natural disturbances by combining fire to management and harvest in such situations? And this is something we have been exploring quite long. And one of our main approach and facility for doing this is a large-scale experiment, the acronym FIRE, that we started now more than 20 years ago. And it was especially aimed to answer or to reveal the role of fire in the context of intensively managed landscape. And so we decided a very classic type factorial experiment with two factors involved. The first one is fire, the existence of fire, as you can see between top and bottom rows. And then we had harvests, and more specifically, it was also harvest intensity, because that was interesting aspect in managed context and also possibly with its interactions with fire. So there are control sites on the left, either burned but no harvests, or kind of full complete controls with no treatments at all. And then 3 levels of cuttings, 50 cubic meters retained, 10 cubic meters retained, and then kind of very traditional Fennoscandian type of clear cut with no retention at all. And that's kind of the indication of forest intensity, management intensity. 3 replicates of each treatment combination, so it gives 24 forest stands in total. And they are each about roughly 4 hectares in size. So they are, in our perspective, they are quite large scale, not perhaps from a Canadian perspective, not necessarily, but in our system, 4 hectares is typical forest management unit here. So they are located in different stands, so they are replicated at stand level and located in eastern Finland, quite close to where we are now. We will have a chance to visit at least one site tomorrow during the excursion. And the distance between each site is at least 1 kilometer. The colors indicate the burning. You don't see the retention coded in this map. How they look from the air. This is a photo taken quite soon after the fires. This is one stand, fall score photo. So the green is the study site burned. And you can also see the retention trees, in fact, or shadows of the retention trees are there, those black stripes there. Coming down to ground level, it looks something like this. This is also 50 cubic meter per hectare retention, and taken maybe, I think, 1 year after, next year after the fires. There are also in the front some smaller subset experiments going on, just not necessarily. But you can see what does it look to have 50 cubic meters. It's about 17% of the volume that were there before the cuttings. We have quite extensive sampling and monitoring going on, and covering several kind of ecosystem characteristics or features of these forests that were initially pine-dominated with some spruce understory trees, and we have been looking at the structures, tree structures, but also other characteristics. But then our main goal has been really the different taxa, because we have been interested, and main motivation for the study was the effects of fires and harvest intensity on biodiversity. So we have looked at invertebrates, plants, fungi, whatever you can see on the sampling scheme on the right. Now this talk, I have only very limited amount of time, so I will talk to you mostly about beetles that were sampled by 3 different methods, and the method that these data come from now are from these freely hanging window traps. Beetles are very good in studying forest aspects, I think, because they are highly diverse group, hundreds of species in every study, ecologically heterogeneous, so they are kind of very accurate or precise sensors of what's going on in the forest. In different trophic levels, we have species, and their life histories are pretty well known for this kind of purposes. So, what did we find? What have we found so far? Let's look at first the effect of retention, so harvest intensity, and not related to fire yet at all. But here you see, this is now discovers saproxylic beetles. So these are beetles that are associated with dead wood. That's generally highly threatened group. They have declined in Finland and elsewhere in Europe because of the intensive forest management and because of the lack of dead wood from the managed forest. And here we have on the x-axis we have these different retention levels, clear cut on the left and control on the right, and those 2 retention levels 10 and 50 cubic meters per hectare in the middle. And what is in the y-axis is the change in the average number of these species per plot per site during 11 years. So this 11-year effect. And after clear cut, we still have about 30 species less of these saproxylic species on clear cut sites, whereas the retention alleviates these negative effects clearly, especially when the retention level is 50 cubic meters. As you can see, then it's significantly above 0, even we get higher numbers than before the cuttings. Quite surprisingly, control forests, the beetle richness has increased in control forests on the right, which of course underlines the importance of having controls in every experiment, but it also tells that the forests are changing also in the control sites, probably due to natural succession, windstorms that create more dead wood and food and resources for these species. Okay, so retention and harvest intensity is one of the key aspects to address kind of biodiversity concerns in these forests. But what about fire then? That was absent, that has been absent for 150 years or so. Now, this is a slightly more complicated picture now, and why is it complicated is that we are mostly interested in species that are rare, threatened, and are of conservation or management concern. We need to get data of those species, how they can be kind of facilitated and with what methods. Observing and getting quantitative data of these rare species is quite time-consuming indeed. And it's also heavily dependent on sample size, as we know. More time, resources, bigger samples we have, more we find rare species. That's kind of expected. And we have to somehow control that. And now in this slide, x-axis shows the total number of species, which indicates the sampling effort in this case. And on the y-axis, we have number of rare and red listed species in our system. So it just basically standardizes the comparison, and the information and the message is shown with the distance between these two lines. The above line, the line above is orange colored dots, and they are burned sites, and the white ones are unburned sites. And what is the message is that on burned sites, we get on average 4 more of these threatened rare species than on unburned sites. Sounds marginal, but remember that we are talking about very rare species here, those that are very rarely found in normal usual forest. So it's a big effect ecologically, and it's a big message for the management that fire really promotes these rare and threatened species. But then we have some complicating factors to consider in this context, and one is the temporal changes. So time is very important when looking at the effects of fire, also the effects of any management, I think that relates to timber, forest timber, but especially for the fire, because it seems and looks that many aspects, features related to fire are very ephemeral. So they come immediately, quickly after the fire, but they disappear also very quickly thereafter. And good example are these Aradus flatbucks, a very specialized group of invertebrates. In our area, 24 species were collected, about more than 1,200 individuals. And what you can see here is an ordination picture. So axis, those of you who are not familiar with the method, you can imagine that the axes are like coordinates in the map. They don't have any other information content. They are mapped, and closer the dots are, the more closer or more similar are the composition of these flatbuck communities. And if you start from year 2000, from the left, black areas are burned and white areas are unburned. They are very similar, all the 24 forest sites we had. But then we have the burnings and the harvests, so that 2021 treatments were completed. And as you can see, the burned sites hosted very different composition of these Aradus species. So we got many pyrophilos, fire-loving species that came there immediately after the fire, even in the same year, at the end of the same summer that the forests were burned. But then they disappeared almost as quickly. In 2002, they had returned almost back to the level they were before the treatments. So a typical example of these temporal effects we find after the fire. They come and go in 2 years, and this is not an isolated case. We have other groups, other taxa, like other beetles, but also other fungi that exist on burnt litter, for example, on forest soil. They come very quickly, but they also disappear very quickly. And this, of course, suggests that we have to have fires continuously available at the landscape level to maintain these species. They can stay on one specific stand only for a couple of years, but in order to survive in the area, there must be another site within the dispersal distance for them to survive. Really complicates the fire management and bringing the fire and its positive biodiversity effect to the system. Looking at the composition as a whole, the community as a whole, those previous results were about species richness and some specific group. But what about beetle assemblages as a whole? We are not looking actually whole beetle assemblages, but again, these subroxylid species that are so clearly associated with wood and of course with forests. And this is again ordination. So remember, axis or coordinates, axis points are like coordinates on the map. And points close to each other mean that the species assemblages are similar in their composition in terms of species identities and their abundances. Black dots are, first of all, 24 black dots. So what was the situation before the treatments in summer 2000? So they were very close to each other. We had quite similar types of forests. The color denotes the burning. So orange colors are burned sites and green colors are unburned. And the size of the symbol is related to the amount of timber remaining in the forest. So big symbols denote unharvested and very small symbols denote 0 cubic meter per hectare. And as you can see, the control forests, the green control forest didn't change that much as expected and as was hoped. But all the treatments, all the harvests and all the burnings caused dramatic changes in the community composition, but clearly depended also on whether the disturbance was harvest or fire. I think the most interesting, perhaps, message in this figure is that if we think that unharvested burned sites are some sort of resemble mostly the wildfire, so without any harvesting, and then all the harvested sites are somehow kind of managed areas, you can see that the composition in those different situations is rather different. So natural legacies and managed legacies, if we use these retention trees together with fire and compare them with the unharvested burned sites, they differ clearly. So that, of course, means that natural legacies do not completely correspond to managed legacies. And this is most likely related to the exact resources and substrates that are produced with different types of treatments. So fire, prescribed fire in harvested sites cannot provide as diverse resources and substrates as burning unharvested forest. And I think you will see this tomorrow in the field excursion. Now, this is again short-term effect, but it's a little bit more complicated if you look at the 10-year effect, but basically the message remains the same. And now we have 20-year data, but that's under preparation. We just finished the fieldwork a month ago and expect to get the results soon, but I haven't anything to tell about those yet to you, unfortunately. But then we have some challenges here, of course. This experiment, I think it shows quite nicely how the fire modifies the communities and how fire intensity is then kind of interacting with fire. But it's still just, it's a large scale, but it's located in one area. Is it valid? Can we generalize the results to other sites, even within Finland? That was kind of something we were worried from the beginning. And we couldn't possibly have resources to repeat the whole experiment in other places. It takes lots of people and lots of resources, lots of time. But we took kind of shortcut here and looked at this effect by burning nine forests in different sites across Finland. And not with specific timber or harvest treatment, just selecting similar forests, similar age, similar forest type, and burning them at the same season as much as possible, and then looking at short-term effects. So having hopefully comparable situation, except that the location was different, location of each burned forest. And yes, the location matters. It really matters in our system, as you can see. If we somewhat artificially divide these areas into west and east areas, and then look at, again, these rare species, we find a big difference in the response of these assemblages. So all pyrophylla species, red-listed species, we get much stronger response on the eastern side of the country than on the western side. Clearly statistical signal. Why so? Well, we can discuss and speculate. We don't know yet exactly, to be sure, what's the reason, but the management history, the history of intensive management is somewhat shorter in the east, and we also have the proximity of Russian forests that still kind of have had longer fire history, or fire history coming closer to these times, and they may provide colonizers to these sites. But anyway, it shows that the landscape context really matters in how effective are these, if we talk them about management options or restoration options, we have to kind of consider also the landscape context. So to conclude, Clearly, controlled reintroduction and maintenance of these mimic natural disturbances like fire is a powerful way to promote and maintain biodiversity, even if we have had such a long period of fire suppression in our system. But I think we are starting to understand these aspects, but we still have many challenges, both from a management and scientific perspective, is that how can we restore sufficient variation quantity of fire-based substrates? How can we ensure continuity, which is of course kind of planning issue, and then recognizing these effects of the landscape context on the outcome. So these are kind of big modifiers of how fire can be used to promote and maintain forest biodiversity. So many people have been involved. At least maybe a few hundreds of people have been involved, but I would like to especially mention the PhD students who have been working with the system. We have 11 completed PhD theses and 3 more are coming underway. But thank you.
Thanks, Jari. Together with the speech of Matt, it highlights the importance of understanding and modeling the complexity of forest fires. Is there any question in the room? Yes, Lee.
Yes. You present very convincing argument for biodiversity to restore the fire, but do you have any other arguments such as better tree growth or other study that show that it would be a good thing to do?
Prescribed burning as such is a very old traditional silvicultural method in Finnish forestry. It was practiced quite widely, especially on state-owned land up until 1980s or 1990s. And then we happened to have a couple of big wildfires, and people kind of become afraid of using fire in the forest ecosystems because it's somewhat risky. But yes, it has been used for soil preparation for a long time, and I think it's clearly is one way why it can be to promote also trees. And in our studies, we have been looking also other aspects like this, what are nowadays famously called ecosystem services, like pollination or berry production and things like that. And there are some positive effects on those aspects also, but I wouldn't say readily anything that would valid generally in every case, because there are kind of pros and cons. Some issues are difficult to say that they are good for like forest growth. For example, we have some pest species, some fungal species associated with burned soil that can affect tree seedlings. But on the other hand, you might have some other aspects related to new tree generation establishments in relation to fire. So a little bit complicated to say anything like one or a couple of words.
Thank you.
Just one question about your finding and how you place your finding in the context of climate changes and the increase of, even if at present day fire is not a big issue in Finland, but we are totally agree with the fact that in the future it will be the case, and we will have also big fire in Finland in the future, probably, but we're not sure. But how you can place your finding in this context of climate changes?
Well, I think there are at least 2 questions: how climate change affects the occurrence of fires, and then how fires affect the climate change possibly. That's what they do. But I think the latter one is perhaps something that comes more close to our. So what happens in relation to like carbon dynamics of forests when they are burned? And of course, the starting point is that people usually have this, at least in our context, false impression that when a forest burns, it burns to ashes and releases lots of carbon. But that's not the case. I mean, many of our fires are quite low severity fires, and even the high severity fires tend to release only a very small fraction of carbon from the forest. So like the carbon that is in tree trunks or below ground, it stays in the ecosystem. So the question is, I think, what happens to this carbon that is stored in the forest during the wildfires, and it seems to stay there surprisingly long. We have just recently, actually, this summer, completed some monitoring studies from a wildfire area, real wildfire area, 30 years after the very severe stand replacing fire. And of the above ground tree biomass, there are roughly 2/3 still remaining after 30 years of the carbon in the forest. So it hasn't released carbon that much, and it has been staying there for extended periods. So naturally, that must be compared to the situation in our case. What would happen to the timber carbon if it would be removed and used for wood products, for example? And there are some calculations with obviously quite some strong assumptions, but they indicate that leaving these trees in the forest to decay is better way to store carbon than producing pulp and paper, which is short-lived product. Mm-hmm. So again, I don't know. It's these are complex questions.
And this in the axis of biodiversity, because we show that fire can promote biodiversity. So, and do you think that we will need also to use this tool to promote the biodiversity in the future?
Well, we are doing that at the moment, but not at a very large scale. But in Finland and in Fennoscandia, it's done already. But I think in the future, hopefully, fire will be seen in managed forest in a controlled way much more often than it is now, because of its obvious and strong positive impacts on biodiversity. It's not only these pyrophyllous species, of course. It's the forest structures that form after long periods of time after the fire, like we are talking about 20, 30, 50 years at least, that you can still see the effects of fire on forest ecosystems that are important for species. And those are not pyrophile species, they are other forest dwellers.
There is one last question like that.
Yeah, great talk. I was wondering, do you have any idea what how the insect response varies as a function of fire severity? Would you expect the same kind of response with maybe a mixed or a high severity fire?
That's a very important question, I think, and it plays a very big role in the whole system. Fire severity, we couldn't directly address fire severity because it's so difficult experimentally to manipulate fire severity, and very almost impossible to create these extremely strong stand replacing, like what you were talking about. They're too dangerous to implement experimentally. But I'm sure that will have a big influence. Low severity or middle severity fires that are often here, they are interesting because they tend to have quite a lot of spatial heterogeneity in their effect within the fire, as we, I think, was already so that's known for a long time. And that heterogeneity also provides very diverse resource base, and it also provides very diverse dynamics of trees following the fire. So it has clearly the effect on species of how severe the fire is. But I would imagine that especially low severity, mid severity fires promote insects at least better than high severity fires. High severity fires may kind of promote some like outbreaking species, some part beetles, for example, but not necessarily as well the whole subproxylic community.
Thanks.